to just sort of welcome everybody. And if you are still around at the end, I will announce that the next meeting is 20th of June. And it's someone called Glyn Rees who does a blog on the building stones of London. And I originally asked him to do Upper Watergate, but I hope to persuade him to do it more than that. He says the Upper Watergate is the oldest passageway lined with granite sets in the world, I think. But anyway, it's very old. Right, over to you, Alan, and back to our speaker.
Thank you. Yeah, hello and welcome everybody. Just admitting somebody else who's just joined us. Yeah, welcome to everybody. We've got a good turnout for a post-bank holiday Tuesday. Nick Higham is our speaker today. He just last year wrote this, or published this. He wrote during the lockdown, and it's just come out in paperback. I've got a signed copy. I'll show you. There you are. There you are. Definitely a signed copy. Nick and I used to work on Broadcast magazine almost 40 years ago, which is quite scary. And since then, he went off to do great things at the BBC. He was media correspondent and so on. Then he took retirement from the BBC and spent a lot of time writing about London's water system. So I will hand over to Nick, who's going to talk about private greed, public good, a history of London's water. It's been fascinating. I saw this a few weeks ago at Greater London Industrial Archaeology Society. So I hope it's as good as it was then, because it was great. And I'm looking forward to hearing it again. Nick, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alan. I hope that you do indeed enjoy it the second time around. I gave the lecture just the other day to an audience which included a woman who she told me she had heard the lecture 3 times. So it clearly does stand up to at least one repeat visit. There we are. I'm trying to get the slideshow up. There we are from the beginning. Thank you very much for inviting me. Great pleasure to be here, metaphorically speaking, digitally anyway. Alan's just been very nice about the book, which is called The Mercenary River, and the publishers, it came out just over a year ago, and the publishers gave it this wonderfully striking cover, the hardback version, with this gold river. And if you were to look at that cover and glance at the title, you might assume that it was a book about the River Thames. I can see why you might think that, and I'm afraid if that was what you were hoping or expecting, you're going to be disappointed, because it's not about the River Thames. Thames makes lots of appearances in the book, but it is by no means the main character. As Alan hinted, it is a history of London's water supply, but it doesn't say that because, candidly, if you put a history of water supply on the front cover of a book, I don't think anybody would buy it. People have this notion that water supply is rather boring. They somehow, I think it's just about pumps and pipes. Now, I know that many of the people in this audience will appreciate the pumps and pipes. That's what they come for. They're really enthusiastic about pumps and pipes. But many people are less enthusiastic about pumps and pipes. What they don't realize is that water supply and its history is very complex and I think absolutely fascinating. I would say that, but the researching the book and writing the book took me into a whole set of areas. Business history, because the private water companies that served London for many years pioneered some of the business techniques that we now take for granted in the modern world. It's a political history, because London's water was a very important and controversial political issue, particularly in the 19th century. It's a social history, because I write about the way people used water, mainly for doing the laundry and for cooking and so on. It's a history of science, because studying water and waterborne disease was terribly important in the development of a number of sciences, including bacteriology and epidemiology. And so the book is very varied and quite a kind of complicated set of ideas all coming together. And I can't possibly reflect that in a sort of 45-minute lecture, so I'm not even going to try. There are lots of things in the book that are not going to be talked about tonight. I am not, for instance, going to talk about fraudulent accounting in Victorian business, though there is a chapter about that in the book. I am not going to talk about the history of local government in London and its relevance to the water industry. Again, there is a chapter about that in the book. I'm not going to tell you why one London water company in the 1870s deliberately cut off some 2,000 households, maybe 20,000 people, even though it knew they had no alternative source of water and weren't likely to have for many weeks and maybe months. If you want to know about that, I'm afraid you're going to have to buy the book. And I'm not going to tell you what one London water company did in 1866 when it was told that its product was quite literally killing its customers. Again, if you want to find about that, you're going to have to buy the book. So what am I going to talk about? Well, with apologies for the fact that you are a South London organisation, and this is very much a North London phenomenon, I'm going to start by talking about this. It's called the New River, and it's not a river, and it's not new. It's not a river because it is a man-made aqueduct constructed to bring fresh drinking water from Hertfordshire to the City of London. And it's not new because it was completed in 1613, more than 400 years ago. And it is still, remarkably, a fully functioning part of London's water supply. About 10% of London's drinking water comes down the New River every day and goes off to a treatment plant in the Lee Valley near Walthamstow. And it's interesting partly because it's quite old, but also because of the circumstances surrounding its construction and then its subsequent history. It used originally to bring water from two springs near Ware, but they very quickly proved inadequate to the demand. And so nowadays, almost all the water in the New River comes out of the River Lee, and halfway between Hertford and Ware, if you walk along the towpath, you'll see this building, which is called New Gauge. It was constructed in the 1850s, and every day a maximum of 22.5 million gallons of water comes through that aperture at the bottom, out of the Lee, into the top of the New River. And it originally ran about 41 miles, following a very, if you look at a map, very circuitous route through the landscape. And this was because it was hugging the 100-foot contour to the east of, sorry, beg your pardon, to the west of the River Lee. And it flowed a very, very gradual slope, about 5 inches a mile, which is remarkable considering when the route was surveyed and when it was constructed. The water just flowing down by gravity to a terminal point, a reservoir in between Islington and Clerkenwell. Since it was originally constructed, it's been shortened. First of all, a lot of the more expansive bends were taken out, replaced either with pipes or with little aqueducts. And more importantly, in 1946, it ceased to run south of Stoke Newington, and so about 2.5–3 miles of the route was chopped off. One of the reasons I got interested in it was I live close to where it used to run, and it's left its marks in the streetscape. You can see in the parks and roads around where I live, you can see where the New River used to run, and I found that very intriguing. The man who constructed it and then created the New River Company to do the building and to manage the business, selling water to Londoners, was called Hugh Middleton. And he's a remarkable figure. He was a very entrepreneurial and energetic figure. He was a goldsmith in Jacobean London. Goldsmiths they were rich. They had ready access to lots and lots of cash and to things that could be turned rapidly into cash. But he was more than just that. He was arguably, possibly a philanthropist. He was certainly very interested in works that would improve the public realm, public well-being. He was given by James I a baronetcy, which meant he was allowed to call himself Sir Hugh Middleton and to pass the title on to his heirs. And very unusually, he didn't have to pay for the privilege. Most baronets did have to pay because the title had been invented by James I as a money-making wheeze. But Middleton was so genuinely highly regarded by his contemporaries that he was not asked to pay. The Victorians also thought very highly of him. They put that statue up to him on Islington Green. They put up one that's in the foyer of Islington Town Hall. They put up one on the Royal Exchange building opposite the Bank of England, and they put up this one, one of the four corners of Holborn Viaduct. And it's a pity, really, that someone who was so important in the history of London is not better remembered today. He was also very important in the history of the development of business. He was a rich man, but he did not alone himself have sufficient funds to construct the new river. So he formed a venture, a joint stock company, and invited fellow London merchants to take shares in this company in order to raise the money to build the aqueduct. Now, these kinds of ventures were quite familiar to Elizabethan merchants. They usually revolved around overseas trading voyages. And what would happen is that a bunch of merchants would get together, they would raise the cash, they would hire a ship, they would buy a cargo to put into the ship, and they would hold the stock in that cargo jointly. So these were known as joint stock companies. And they would send the ship off, and if all went well, the cargo would be sold, the ship would come back maybe with another cargo, and everybody would make a shocking great profit out of it. And then they'd take their money out again. The key thing about these ventures was that they had no permanent capital. And even the East India Company, when it started under Elizabeth, didn't have any permanent capital. It raised new capital for each voyage. But an aqueduct didn't work like that. You couldn't sell bits of it off piecemeal like you could the cargo of a ship. You couldn't liquidate the whole business and start again. Once you built it, you were stuck with it. And so it needed permanent capital. And one of my contentions in the book is that the New River Company was, in effect, the first significant permanent joint stock company in England. And Middleton had the vision, foresight, to realize that that was a very good way of financing his venture. And as a result, the New River Company is the forerunner, the prototype, if you like, for every subsequent business corporation in history, for good or for ill. Who were the shareholders? Well, here's two of them. The one on the right was a chap called Peter Van Law, who's reputed to have been the richest commoner in England in the reign of James I. He was originally a Dutchman. He was, again, a London merchant. And the one on the left was called Sir John Backhouse. And he was invited to get involved because he owned the land at the southern end of the New River, at which the New River terminated and which became known as New River Head, where the New River Company built a reservoir. And he was obviously very proud of his association with the New River, because when some years later he had his portrait painted, he asked the artist to include a little landscape painting of New River Head, and his arm is resting on it. And you can perhaps just see underneath a sort of bright sky, a prospect of London. And in the foreground, there is a round circular reservoir surrounded by an irregular pond. The irregular pond was originally a duck pond. And next to this round reservoir, there is a little building which became known as the Waterhouse, which housed the taps that controlled the flow of water from the reservoir down to customers in the city. And there was one other very important shareholder, and that was this man, the King, James I. He got involved because shortly after construction of the aqueduct started, a number of the landowners along the route started cutting up rough. It's not entirely clear what they were objecting to, probably wanted more money, but either way, they were threatening to get an act of parliament which would rescind the act, which gave Middleton the authority to construct the thing in the first place. And Middleton was obviously, amongst his many other skills, was a very effective politician. So he neutralized this potential opposition by going straight to the top, straight to James I. And he made James an offer. He said, if you put up half the cost of building my new river, I will give you a half share in it and half the profits when it becomes profitable, because Middleton said it will become very profitable. And James thought that was a good deal. And indeed, it was. It was a very good deal. Unfortunately, James's son, Charles I, was, in many respects, the worst king in modern times. And among his many egregious mistakes was the decision that he took as soon as he ascended the throne to sell his father's stake in the New River. He sold his shares back to Middleton for £500 down and £500 a year in perpetuity. And when I tell you that the New River Company went on to become the most profitable business in British history, you will see that Charles had made a really bad mistake. What is the evidence for its profitability? In the 1980s, an historian sat down and worked out what one of the original shareholders would have received if by some miracle they had survived right through from the early 17th century to 1904, when the company, along with the other private water companies in London, was taken over by something called the Metropolitan Water Board. If you take into account all the dividends paid down the centuries, plus the final purchase price paid by the Metropolitan Water Board, that original investor would have enjoyed a return on investment of 267% per year. And I defy you to name any legitimate investment which could return anything like that kind of money. There's another picture of New River Head. This is from before the Great Fire of London of 1666, because that's old St. Paul's Cathedral in the background. You can see the original duck pond, with the chap sitting there fishing in it. You can see the wall around the circular reservoir. You can see the water house. And there's another prospect from the very early 18th century. By this time, St. Paul's is the one we're familiar with, Christopher Wren's St. Paul's in the background there. And you can see they tidied it up a bit by now. The original pond, in the middle of the pond, the circular reservoir, next to it, the water house. And you can see two other things of interest. One is next to the pond, what looks like a windmill. And the other is in the foreground, a second rectangular reservoir. The windmill, it was a windmill, a revolutionary design. It had 6 sails until twice they blew off in high winds, at which point they scrapped the windmill and turned it into a horse mill with a horse going round and round inside at the bottom, driving a pump. And they needed a pump because they wanted to serve the growing West End of London. London was expanding. The New River Company originally served just the city, but they wanted to get their water into places like Soho and Covent Garden and Bloomsbury. And they rapidly discovered that the head of pressure from the original reservoir was simply not enough to get the water across the valley of the River Fleet and into West London. So they built a second reservoir higher up the hill. And they obviously had to have a pump, a way of getting the water from reservoir number 1 to reservoir number 2. That second reservoir, the rectangular one in the foreground, is also still there, also still a functioning part of London's water supply. It's at the top of the hill as you go up from King's Cross, up Pentonville Road towards the Angel Islington. And these days it's covered over, grassed over. It's in the middle of a square called Claremont Square, but it's still part of London's water supply. One observation about this picture: there are several versions of this landscape view. This one is by an English artist. There is also one by the celebrated Italian artist Canaletto, who came to England and spent several years painting here. And I had always assumed, because Canaletto was such a precise draftsman, that what Canaletto showed you in his paintings was an accurate reflection of what he saw, what was in front of him. And I have to tell you, it's not. Canaletto looked at this landscape, thought, that's a good picture, I'll do that picture. But you know what he said? That reservoir in the foreground is in the wrong place. So he moved it about 200 yards to the right so that it was to balance the composition. And I have never been able to look at a Canaletto ever since and accept that what it appears to show is in fact what it does show. That is a photograph of the round pond at New River Head, taken shortly before the First World War, shortly before it disappeared. The outer pond by this stage had become filter beds. Somewhere in that cluster of buildings on the right, there is the original waterhouse. And today, It's all gone, almost all gone, to be replaced by this, which was completed in the 1920s as a headquarters for the Metropolitan Water Board, and which obliterated almost all traces of the original water house and round pond reservoir, with a couple of exceptions. You go round the back of that building, you'll see these two. The one in the foreground is the base of that windmill, cut down, but retained for a long time as a horse mill, and later as a store by the Metropolitan Water Board and Thames Water. And behind it, the brick building is a building constructed in the 18th century to house a steam pump, which was designed by the celebrated engineer John Smeaton, and which replaced the horse-driven pump. And although that building has been modified and rebuilt and so on many times down the years, parts of it date from the 18th century. And that makes it the oldest surviving steam engine house in London anywhere. The steam engines were ubiquitous by the 19th century. Every factory, plant, brewery, whatever it might be, had a steam engine. That was how things were powered. That was the oldest surviving steam engine house. And these buildings for a long time were rather unloved and neglected. The Metropolitan Water Board and Thames Water didn't know what to do with them. Happily, they have now been taken over by something called the Quentin Blake Museum of Illustration, which hopefully will, later this year, open a museum of illustration, book illustration, in those buildings, and that's very gratifying. And there's one other survival of the old original New River Head, and that's inside that 1920s building, and it's this. It is called, these days it's called the Oak Room because it has oak panelling, but it was originally called the Courtroom because it was where the New River Company's Court of Directors used to meet, and it was constructed in the 1690s in the Waterhouse, and it is a very splendid interior indeed. There is some wonderfully elaborate plasterwork on the ceiling. There's also a painting of the king at the time, William III, on the ceiling. There is some really exquisite wood carving on the panelling, which many people think was done by Grinling Gibbons, the sort of greatest wood carver of the 17th century. It gives you some idea of what the New River Company by the 1690s thought of itself, and also, of course, how much money it had to spend. By the end of the 17th century, there were really only 3 permanent joint stock companies in England of any real importance. One of them was the East India Company, one was the Bank of England, and the third was the New River Company. It was a real force in the land. What, you may be asking yourself, did Londoners do for water before the New River came along? And the answer to that is that there were various ways of getting water. Some people simply dipped a bucket in the Thames. Some people had wells on their property, in their backyards or in their cellars. Some people, many people, went to one of these. This is called a conduit house. There were eventually 16 of them in the streets of medieval London. They brought water into the city from springs outside the walls. The water was conveyed in lead pipes, and they were a free service provided by the city authorities. And if you didn't want to queue up at the conduit house to get water yourself, you could buy it from one of London's water carriers who hawked it round street by street, door to door. And you can see there's a chap standing in the foreground in that picture with a container over his shoulder. That is a water carrier with his tankard, which held 3 gallons. That's another picture of a London water carrier with a tankard. The difficulty was that by the end of the 16th century, by the reign of Elizabeth, there simply wasn't enough water to go around. London had quadrupled in size in the space of a century. It had about 50,000 inhabitants in 1500 and about 200,000 by 1600. And there simply wasn't enough water. So the New River Company was an answer to that problem. And it wasn't actually the first. There was another one before the New River Company. It started up in the 1580s, started by a Dutchman or a German called Peter Moritz. And it was called the London Bridge Waterworks. This is a picture of 2 pictures of London Bridge. On the top there, the familiar medieval bridge with the houses on it. at the bottom, you won't believe it when I say this, but that is exactly the same bridge. The houses were demolished and taken away in the 18th century, but the underlying structure remained the same. And in both of those pictures, at the left-hand end, the northern end, you can see a wooden structure sitting in water, and that is protecting the water wheels of the London Bridge waterworks, which were installed under a number of arches of London Bridge. The current drove the water wheel drove a pump which pumped water up into a tank and a standpipe on the shore. And in the bottom picture on the left, you can see the structure housing the standpipe. And Moritz did something nobody had done before. He laid pipes throughout the city of London, down all the main streets, buried pipes, and he was very happy for anybody whose house was passed by one of these pipes to make a connection and take some of his water, provided they paid him. And in the process, he more or less invented the modern utility company. We are very familiar with the idea that networks exist which bring water, gas, electricity, telecoms to our homes, and that we pay for that privilege, that's a good business to be in. Moritz was the man who first did it. And again, for that reason, we owe him a debt. The London Bridge waterworks survived right through until the demolition of Old London Bridge in 1831. There's the bridge in the 1820s. At the far end, you can just see the water wheels behind their wooden protections. And you may be asking yourself what the quality of the water supplied by the London Bridge waterworks was like, given that it came out of the River Thames. And this was something that exercised contemporaries as well. In 1821, there was a Parliamentary Select Committee inquiry into London's water, the first, by my count, of 16 committees of inquiry, royal commissions of one sort or another, during the rest of the century, looking into London's water. It was, as I said, it was a very live political issue. And the superintendent of the London Bridge waterworks gave evidence at that inquiry, and he was asked about the quality of his water, and he said, people like our water, but they prefer it to the water from the New River Company because it is softer and therefore better for doing the laundry, better for working up a lather with soap, which was, given how important laundry was for personal hygiene, that's not a trivial consideration. And his questioner said, yes, but what about drinking it? And the chap said, I wouldn't dream of drinking it. The pipes that Moritz laid, and which the New River Company also laid, because the New River Company adopted Moritz's business model, were made of wood. They were made of elm logs, hollowed out, bored out, and laid end to end with the thin end of one slotted into the thick end of the next. And mostly, as I say, they were buried, but occasionally they were above ground. And this is a picture of the New River Company's wooden mains traveling west across the River of the Fleet, Valley of the River Fleet towards Soho and Covent Garden. And there's another picture of them actually crossing the Fleet, and it will not surprise you to learn that they leaked. There was nothing new about leaking water mains. They leaked even though they were not kept permanently full of water. What happened was that the water companies in London employed chaps like this. He's called a turncock, and it was his job to go around the streets on a regular schedule, turning on the water street by street for a couple of hours, 2 or 3 hours, every couple of days. And you had to know, therefore, when the water was on, what the schedule was, or you had to have some sort of receptacle in which to store it. And most people had some sort of zinc or lead cistern, a tank, or they had a wooden water butt. This is a portrait, a picture drawing of the backyard of a house in St. Martin's Lane in the 1820s, done by a wonderful artist called George Scharf. It's his own backyard. And you can see there is a big wooden butt, water butt, and above it there is a pipe with a tap. And that's the pipe coming in from the water main in the street. And that tap would have been kept permanently open so as not to miss the water when the turncock turned it on. And there's another tap at the bottom of the water butt for drawing water off for doing the washing and cooking and so on. And the square building in the corner is the household privy. All that was well and good if you were middle class and you owned or rented your own property and you had somewhere to keep a water butt or cistern. Not so good if you were poor and lived in a slum. If you were lucky, your landlord, slum landlord, might install a pump or standpipe like this in one of the courtyards, and he'd charge you a little bit extra on your rent and pass that on to the water company. If you were unlucky, you would have to queue up at the parish pump with somewhat unreliable service. Or worse still, your landlord might install a tank or butt, but a communal one. And those communal water tanks in the slums were a byword for being filthy and disgusting. People would abuse them terribly. They would wash their chamber pots in them. Small boys would play in them. They'd accumulate a great quantity of rubbish and leaves and muck of all sorts. People would often go to considerable lengths not to have to use the water in those communal tanks. And the fact that they were so disgusting was a very powerful argument in the 19th century for introducing what was known as constant supply. Instead of the intermittent water supply, which Londoners were used to, campaigners said, if we have constant supply, water constantly in the pipes, which would be available at the turn of a tap, just as it is for us today in the modern world, then we could get rid of these awful tanks and the poor would have a better life. It won't surprise you to learn that the fact that the new river company made so much money, plus the fact that London was growing, spawned imitators, rival water companies. And here is one of them. This is called the York Buildings Waterworks, which got its water out of the River Thames, roughly where Charing Cross Station is now. And in the foreground there, you can see the old Watergate of York Mansion, York House, the great Strand mansion. And that structure is still there. Doesn't have its feet in the water anymore because Joseph Bazalgette built his embankment in front of it. So it's now in Embankment Gardens, but it's still there. Behind it, you can see the rather striking sort of obelisk-shaped water standpipe of the York Buildings Waterworks. And to the right of that, you can see a chimney with smoke coming out of it. And that is historically significant because it housed the York Buildings Waterworks steam pumping engine. And I said that the engine house at New River Head, designed by John Smeaton, was the oldest surviving, but it wasn't the first. The very first steam engine of any kind installed in London was installed by the York Building Waterworks and used to pump water out of the Thames. They very quickly, in the 18th century, they very quickly actually uninstalled it because they found that it was terribly inefficient and the coal bill was absolutely enormous. But later in the century, steam engine technology improved, it became more cost effective. And so in due course, all along the Thames and the River Lee, there sprang up a whole series of water companies, all with their steam pumping engines. And here are some of them. There's the York Buildings in the middle. Top left is the Lambeth Waterworks, which had its intake roughly where the Royal Festival Hall is now. Top right is the Southwark Waterworks, which had its intake where Southwark Bridge, the southern end of Southwark Bridge is now. Bottom left, and I apologize, that part of this image has got cut off, and I keep meaning to improve it. That is a picture of the Chelsea Waterworks, whose intake was a channel from the River Thames, which filled up at high tide, roughly where the railway line into, actually exactly where the railway line into Victoria now runs. And they had a reservoir underneath where Victoria Station now is. And that's not accidental because when the water company moved out, went upriver, the railway company simply bought the land and installed Victoria Station and the railway lines leading to it along the same route. And bottom right, there is a picture from the 1890s of the pumping station of the Southwark and Vauxhall Waterworks, whose intake and pumping station where Battersea Power Station now is. And they've all gone. They've all disappeared with one exception. In the 1830s, Grand Junction Waterworks built itself a pumping station at Kew Bridge, just on the south side of the river, today where the South Circular Road crosses the river. And they enlarged it in the 1850s, and it's marked by this very handsome Italian campanile type water standpipe. And it's the only survivor. And it is also the home today to the London Museum of Water and Steam. And if you want to know more about this whole subject, I thoroughly recommend a visit to the London Museum of Water and Steam, fascinating place. Not least because it contains several steam pumping engines originally built for and installed in that very pumping station. They're enormous. This is one of them. I can't remember whether this is the 90-inch or the 100-inch. That's another one. That's either the 100-inch or the 90-inch. They are monumental pieces of Victorian engineering, and they're beautiful. Absolutely, I was pretty unenthusiastic about stationary steam engines before I started researching this book, and having seen steam engines like these at work, one of these is occasionally steamed, and there are other veteran steam engines around London which you can go and see. I am a convert. I think they're absolutely marvelous, wonderfully elegant, huge sense of power, but also precision, and every element of them beautifully turned and hand engineered and so on and so forth. And it's worth going to Kew Bridge just to see the steam engines. And they also have an archive at Kew Bridge, which contains, amongst many other things, this photograph, which when I first saw it, I fell in love with instantly, because it seems to me to say so much about Victorian Britain. This is a picture of the largest Cornish steam pumping engine cylinder ever made, made in fact for a pumping station in the Netherlands. Cornwall was a centre of pumping technology manufacture and development because it had loads and loads of deep mines which constantly flooded and they needed pumping out. And this monster was made by one of the three leading firms of Cornish pumping engine manufacturers. It was called Harvey's. It was based at Hale in North Cornwall. And I love this photograph because, first of all, it says this is Britain at the peak of its power. This is for world-beating technology. It's been designed for export. This is the largest ever made. It tells us so much about sort of Victorian industry and its strength. Also tells us a lot about Victorian class distinction. In the middle, you can see old man Harvey leaning on his cane, wearing his top hat with his fur collar on his coat, looking very well dressed. On the left, wearing a bowler hat, you have a middle manager. And on the right, wearing a flat cap, you have the foreman. And he is holding up the scale, which tells you that this monster was fully 12 feet across. It's lying on its side, would originally have been vertical. It speaks volumes, that photograph. Because the New River Company was making so much money, because London was expanding, lots of new water companies started up in the very early part of the 19th century, around about 1809, 1810. They were run by, raised money from Regency businessmen. And Regency businessmen, I have to tell you, were sharks. They make today's hedge fund managers look like pussycats. And they were also, as well as being frankly greedy, not nearly as clever as they thought they were. We now know that water supply is what is called a natural monopoly. It doesn't really make economic sense for more than one company to go to the expense of installing all those pipes and pumps and reservoirs and so on, and then not being able to get 100% of the potential market to pay off the very considerable upfront costs. These chaps didn't realize it. They assumed that the thing to do was to compete with existing water companies and with one another. And so, in many parts of London, 2 and sometimes 3 water companies would all descend on the same area, the same street. They'd all dig up the road, they'd all lay pipes, and then they would try and get the locals to subscribe to their service. And the result was chaos. First of all, the customers got wise to what was going on, and so they started playing one company off against another, and there was price cutting, and the companies used all sorts of dirty tricks to try and win a slice of the market. They used to bribe household servants to switch the house's water supply from one company to another when the head of the household wasn't looking. And it is said that on occasion, gangs of workmen from rival water companies would end up fighting one another in the streets because the rivalry was so intense. And nobody made any money. All these new companies lost money hand over fist. Even the New River Company, which remained profitable, saw its dividends slump from well over £400 a year in the 18th century to about £25 a year in the early part of the 19th century. And so, when it dawned on them what a mess they were making of things, they came to a secret agreement. It had to be secret because many of them operated under Acts of Parliament, which basically forbid them from doing what they were about to do. They reached what they called a general arrangement, and they carved the city up between them into a series of local monopolies. Made perfect sense to them, but it absolutely outraged the customers, who suddenly found overnight that they were no longer being offered water by 2 or 3 rival companies. They had a take it or leave it offer from one company. And guess what? Once they'd done this carve up, what do they all do? Well, they put their prices up by 25%, and it made customers absolutely furious. So London ended up in 1817, north of the river, and rather later south of the river. It ended up with 8 water companies, private water companies. There was the New River Company serving the north and the City of London. There was the East London Waterworks in the East End. 2 companies, the Grand Junction and the West Middlesex, serving what we would think of as the West End. The Chelsea Waterworks, serving Chelsea and Westminster. The Kent Waterworks, serving your part of the city. The Southwark and Vauxhall Waterworks, serving much of the rest of South London. And the Lambeth Waterworks. And the Lambeth and the Southwark and Vauxhall were the only 2 companies which still had a significant area of overlap, which was important for a reason I will come back to in a minute. A little bit about the Kent Waterworks. It started off taking water in the very beginning of the 18th century, 1701, from the Ravensbourne in what is now Brook Mill Park, and it built just upstream from Deptford, and it built a reservoir there. This is a picture of that reservoir in 1840. And by the end of the 18th century, the Ravensbourne Waterworks, which I don't think ever served a great many people or ever had a great deal of water, was owned, in fact, by John Smeaton, the engineer. And then a new company, the Kent Waterworks Company, was formed and got an Act of Parliament in 1809 and took over the Ravensbourne Waterworks and began distributing its water more widely, including to Woolwich Arsenal, which was a very important customer. And because I think Ravensbourne water was so scanty, the company sank a series of wells, the first one in 1859, underneath that modern pumping station, which belongs to Thames Water and is just on the other side of the Ravensbourne from Brook Mill Park. And it discovered that because of the particular geology of southeast London, there was enormous amounts of water down in the ground, which it was relatively easy to pump up. It was much cleaner than anything out of the Ravensbourne or the Thames or the River Lee. And so it sank more and more. of these boreholes, and much of southeast London is still served, I believe, by water from boreholes. And by the end of the 19th century, the Kent Waterworks had, from memory, I think it's about 6 or 8 major boreholes and a number of minor ones. And as I say, the very first one is still there on that site underneath that building. The fact that everybody put the prices up after this general arrangement, secret agreement was arrived at, infuriated customers and spawned one of the very first consumer campaigns in Britain. And this is one manifestation of that. This is from the 1820s. It's a cartoon called John Bull's Waterworks, or Unfeeling Speculators Threatening to Cut Off One of the Necessaries of Life. And it's basically, not to put too fine a point on it, it is a riot of cock jokes. The beefy chaps with axes are water company turncocks. They are threatening to cut off the taps or cocks of any customers who don't pay the enormous charges which are now being levied. And on the right there is John Bull straddling his cock, saying, for God's sake, don't cut it off. I shall certainly die for want of it. In the background, there are 2 little boys. One has already lost his cock, poor little chap. The other one is about to lose his cock. And on the left, there's a woman straddling what she calls her husband's cock, trying to keep the turncock at bay. Somebody once asked me, when I was giving one of these lectures, whether there was any sex in my book. And I said, no, there is no sex. This is a book about water supply. And then I remembered this cartoon. And it occurs to me, actually, that there is just a smidgen, a hint of sex. She is showing an awful lot of leg. And I do wonder whether the implication is that if the turncock were to treat her household kindly, he might find something to his advantage. And in the middle of that cartoon, floating around, there is a sort of piece of paper, which we enlarge that. It says, Bill in Parliament to authorise certain parishes to supply themselves with water to check the extortions of the monopolising companies. This is one of the very first instances I've been able to find of an idea appearing publicly, which was to become, through the course of the 19th century, more and more important, more and more salient. And that was the idea that maybe it would be a good idea not to leave something as important for the public welfare as water supply in the hands of private profit-making companies who were more interested in paying dividends than in serving the public. And the public ownership, in this instance, the suggestion is that the water supply should be taken over by the parishes, which were the forerunners of today's borough councils. Lots of other suggestions were canvassed during the course of the 19th century. The other thing that consumers were very unhappy about was the quality of the water. What happened in the early part of the 19th century was that some clever fellow invented the flushing water closet. Up until then, Londoners had in almost every case a cesspit on either behind or underneath their property, which filled up with the contents of the privy and periodically had to be emptied by chaps called gong farmers or night soil men who worked at night, emptied, dug the ordure out of the cesspit, piled it onto a cart, and then took it out to the outskirts of London, where it was sold to farmers and market gardeners as fertilizer, and would then produce would then come back into the town. The problem with the water closet was that it flushed the stuff away very quickly and very effectively from the point of view of the householder, but the traditional cesspit very, very quickly overflowed with all that water. And so people diverted the outflow of their water closets into the existing network of sewers, which had only been designed to take rainwater runoff. And they debouched straight into the River Thames. And the result of that was that the sewers became absolutely foul and the Thames became absolutely foul, one great cesspit, as somebody said. Because the Thames is a tidal river, the stuff, once it got into the Thames, the river, never went away. It would go downstream on the tide, but then the tide would change and it would come back up again. And there are stories of people watching the same carcass of a dead dog go back and forth for several days in a row on the tide. And people noticed and were unhappy about this, and this is one manifestation. This is a pamphlet called The Dolphin or Grand Junction Nuisance. And a dolphin is a structure in water which is there to protect something. And the dolphin in this case is this little thing that looks like an octagonal garden shed sitting in the river. It is protecting the intake pipe of the Grand Junction waterworks. And on the bank, you can see the waterworks, pumping station and chimney. This is not the one at Kew Bridge. This is an earlier one before the company moved its intake upriver. So you know where we are. To the left is Chelsea Royal Hospital. And in between the two, there is a channel. And that channel is a sewer. And the author of the pamphlet pointed out that everything that came down the sewer was likely to get sucked into the intake of the water company because of where it was situated, and then pumped out into the mains and sent on its way to customers. As a result, he said, people were being offered a fluid saturated with the impurities of 50,000 houses, a dilute solution of animal and vegetable substances in a state of putrefaction, alike offensive to the sight, disgusting to the imagination, and destructive to health. And he wasn't wrong. The scientists backed him up. These illustrations were made in 1850 by a man called Arthur Hassell, who examined London's water, samples of all the water supplied by the London water companies under a microscope. And he found lots of little creatures, he called them animalcules, living in the water. He also found things there, things like half-digested muscle fibers, which he concluded could only have got into the water by way of the human gut. And he concluded, likewise, that according to the present system of London's water supply, a portion of the inhabitants of the metropolis are made to consume a portion of their own excrement, and moreover, to pay for the privilege. And the cartoonist got in on this one as well. This is a cartoon called Monster Soup, commonly called Thames Water. The old lady is looking through a microscope, horrified to see all these little creatures swimming around in the water. And she's been drinking a cup of tea, but her cup has fallen from her nerveless fingers now that she realizes what is in the water. And the cartoonists also got in on this. This is a cartoon, a very interesting cartoon from the 1840s. And it shows one of the company turncocks going round on his rounds and two little boys looking at him. And one is saying to the other, I say, Tommy, I'm blowed if there isn't a man a turning on the cholera. And the reason this is interesting was that in the 1840s, cholera had only recently arrived in Britain in the 1830s. It was a horrible disease, absolutely terrifying. And yet, and nobody knew quite where it came from, what caused it, why it was there. The scientists of the day believed, like most disease, it was carried in bad air or miasma, and they associated disease with bad smells, which is not such an absurd thing to do because the worst parts of London for disease were the slums, and they smelt awful, they smelt dreadful. And they would not accept the suggestion, which was advanced by a few brave souls, that maybe there was something in the water which was making people ill and giving them cholera. The public in the 1840s, and this is not the only cartoon which makes this, but I've seen another one, the public knew that there was something wrong with the water. It was quite possible that cholera was in the water. And the man who demonstrated that this was indeed the case, one of my heroes, a man called Dr. John Snow. He was a pioneering anaesthetist and a pioneering epidemiologist. And there's a famous story about him, which is, it's more complex than the famous story suggests. The real situation was a bit more complex. But nonetheless, Snow, when cholera arrived in London, when a periodic wave of cholera came in 1854, there was a particularly bad outbreak near his home in Soho, and he went to investigate, and he plotted on a map where people in Soho had died of cholera, and he realized that the deaths were clustered around one particular street in the centre of Soho called Broad Street, which is now called Broadwick Street. And he went and investigated, and he found that there was a parish pump in Broad Street, and he persuaded the local authority to take the handle off the pump, and the outbreak stopped. From this, Snow concluded that the cholera had been in the water. The story is more complicated than that, but that's the broad outline. And he was right. Unfortunately, his contemporaries would not accept it. He did another piece of work, and the same cholera outbreak, which also affected South London very badly, 1854. And South London, you'll remember, was the only part of the city where two water companies still competed side by side with one another for households in the same area. So you would have in South London, parts of South London, households which got their water from the Southwark and Vauxhall waterworks right next to households getting their water from the Lambeth waterworks, identical in every respect except for their water supply. And Snow discovered that the number of deaths from cholera in Southwark and Vauxhall households was almost 10 times higher than in households that got their water from the Lambeth waterworks. And you would think that this would be conclusive demonstration that cholera was waterborne. In fact, Snow died in 1850, I can't remember, it was either 1858 or 59, and his theory was still not accepted. The Lancet ridiculed him, said he's lost his mind in the sewers. It wasn't until the 1860s, several years after his death, that public health professionals and scientists finally began to say to themselves, you know what, maybe Snow was right, maybe the cholera is in the water. Why, you may be asking, was there that big difference between deaths in Southwark and Vauxhall homes and Lambeth homes? Well, in 1852, 2 years before that cholera outbreak, the Lambeth waterworks, whose intake was originally, you'll remember, where the Festival Hall is now, had moved its intake upriver beyond the tidal Thames to a place called Seething Wells near Kingston. And this was because the chief engineer of the Lambeth waterworks, a man called James Simpson, who is another of my heroes, deserves to be better known. James Simpson had realized that there was absolutely no way that he could clarify the water that he was getting out of the tidal Thames sufficiently to pass it on to his customers with a good conscience. So he persuaded his directors to spend a very considerable amount of money, which they could afford because London was growing so quickly, and move their whole operation upriver to Seething Wells. So by the time the cholera came along in 1854, Lambeth Waterworks customers were getting nice clean water from upstream at Seething Wells, but Southwark and Vauxhall Waterworks customers were still getting horrible polluted water out of the tidal Thames, pumped out at what is now Battersea Power Station. Interestingly, in 1852, the same year as the Lambeth new waterworks opened, the government passed the first legislation governing what London water companies would do. The government in the very early 19th century was extremely reluctant to pass any kind of legislation because it viewed the private water companies as the private property of their shareholders. And one of the things that governments at that period thought they should not be doing was interfering with private property rights. But the outcry was such that in 1852, they passed the Metropolis Water Act, and that required a number of things. It required all the water companies taking water out of the tidal Thames and the tidal Lee to do what James Simpson had already done voluntarily and move their intakes upstream to the non-tidal area. And it also required them to filter their water, to purify it. Here is a picture of Hampton Waterworks in the 1890s, where there are three very magnificent pumping stations built by three companies, the Southwark and Vauxhall, the West Middlesex, and the Grand Junction. And in the foreground, you can see a slow sand filter bed, which has been emptied so that the sand can be cleaned. And James Simpson was the man who introduced the slow sand filter bed to London, a technique which is still used for filtering around 2/3 of London's water. So we owe him a double debt. And slow sand filters are the layers of gravel and coarse sand and fine sand. You flood water onto the top of this, it trickles down through the layers of sand and gravel, comes out at the bottom clean. And James Simpson and his contemporaries assumed that what was happening here was essentially the mechanical filter straining out the bits. What we now know is that slow sand filters actually work biologically, because on the top of the sand there forms something called a Schmutzdecke, which is a German word meaning, I'm told, slime blanket. And basically, it is a layer of good bugs that eat all the nasty bugs in the raw water and gets rid of 98% of them. What comes out at the bottom is clean water. One other very quick mention of legislation: there was a second Metropolis Water Act in 1871, which introduced the first regulators of London's water. One was the water examiner responsible for quality, Major Frank Bolton, when he was appointed, later Colonel Sir Francis Bolton. And the other was a government auditor of the water companies, a man called Alan Stoneham, seen there in extreme old age, cradling his grandson at his grandson's christening. And Stoneham was a civil servant who was appointed government auditor of the water companies, and his job was to ensure that they didn't fiddle the books at the expense either of their customers or of their shareholders. And Stoneham actually did a very good job. Bolton, I think, suffered from what we would call regulatory capture. He got a bit too close to the companies and was not as effective as he might have been. They were the forerunners of today's water regulators, the Environment Agency, Ofwat, the Drinking Water Inspectorate. And why do we have to have regulators today? Well, because the 19th century, having learnt the hard way that it's a good idea to take water supply into public ownership, the Thatcher government in the 1980s privatised Britain's water companies again, and thereby hangs a long and complex tale, which I'm not going to tell today. But the performance of the water companies since 1989 has been little short of scandalous, and the regulators have failed to do their job, and it has become once more a major political issue. But I'll leave it there and be happy to take questions from anybody who would like to ask them. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. That was great. Excellent. I love that. Let me kick off. If you want to ask questions, you can either unmute yourself and join in and say, but a better way would be to put in them in chat at the bottom of your screen. There's a little button called chat, and you can type them in there. I've put a couple of links in the chat to where you can get Nick's book. There's a link to Waterstones, and there's a link to Amazon, and other bookshops and book services are available, no doubt. But those are the two easily available. Has it been published in other parts of the world, Nick, yet? Or is it so large that it wouldn't be?
It's only in the UK, and I suspect only will be, because although I would argue that much of what it says is of wider interest, frankly, it's a book about London's history. It's a London book, so it's you can buy it. And friends saw it in a bookshop in Devon the other day, but basically, it's about London.
Yeah. Would anybody like to jump in? Oliver, perhaps, or somebody like that, to jump in with a question or a comment? Mary?
I was not going to say anything very much. I mean, I've clearly recently done quite a bit of work on Brookmill, but also about two water pumping stations in Charlton, idiotically built by the Kent Water Company on the edge of the marsh. And they picked up cholera, though the Kent Water Company, generally water was standard. It's about location as well, isn't it? I think. But
yes.
Of course, the one is, I think, the James Engine House was built by the Metropolitan Board of Works, but it is a lot earlier than it looks.
The one that I showed the picture of, courtesy of Google Street View, it's there is, the main building is 1930s, but there is part of the building, I made some notes on this earlier today, and I haven't written them down on a piece of paper, which is in front of me. But there is part, you're right, part of the building is rather older than that. It goes back to the 19th century. But they abandoned the river completely in the 1860s. They just went over entirely to taking water from wells, and Kent water became the kind of gold standard. The water examiner would say, Kent water, that's brilliant, that's great. Everybody else's is polluted and dirty.
They had an earlier site up in Plumstead, of course, which I don't know much about, but which there are reservoirs remaining from. And it was the Plumstead company really that took over the Brookmill site. But there's various capped mills at Brookmill, capped wells in various Box of Flats gardens and so on.
So I gather.
We have a comment from William, who says, thanks for interesting talk. The front page of the Financial Times today says water companies increased dividends despite sewage outflows. Yeah, quite. Nick, would you like to comment on that and where we might get from the lamentable situation that we're all in at the moment?
Well,
on our beaches and our rivers and our whatever.
yes, there are a number of issues. The sewage issue has rather overshadowed the other big issue, which hasn't gone away, which is the enormous amounts of water that get wasted because of leaks. A fifth of Thames water going into the pipes never reaches the customers because there are so many leaking pipes, and that I'm sure that will come back at some point. The sewage issue, not unreasonably, is the one that really has caught the headlines. And I noticed somebody in the comments has said that, Fergal Sharkey's done a great job on Twitter of exposing current water companies' arguably criminal behaviour. Actually, it's unarguably criminal. I mean, they have been convicted, several of them, of criminal behaviour and borderline deliberate in one case. That was Thames Water, were fined about £20 million. About 8 years ago. A couple of years ago, Southern Water were fined £90 million for breaking the law deliberately. That was deliberate, lying about the fact that they were discharging all this sewage and the reasons for it. And both the leaking mains and the sewage discharges are, in part at least, a consequence of inadequate investment in infrastructure in the years since privatization, which was ironic because privatization was supposed to release more funds for investment by getting the private sector to come in and put up the money. And actually, for about 10 years, during the 1990s, the system worked quite well. And then the companies and their shareholders got wise to the fact that they were cleverer than the regulators and started to gain the system and run rings around the regulators and took huge amounts, really very troubling amounts of money out of the industry. The figure that's in the book, it's a bit out of date now, but it's the one I can always remember. When the water industry was privatized in 1989, the water companies were privatized without any debt. The government wrote off all the debts. By 2019, they had borrowed £53 billion, which would be fine if they'd invested all that money on building more reservoirs and sewage plants and so on and so forth. They paid themselves in dividends £56 billion. So they were borrowing money simply to pay themselves dividends. And the regulators should and could have stopped that, but failed to do so. And the result now is that many of those shareholders have left the industry. The current crop of shareholders aren't getting any dividends because all the profits are having to go to finance these enormous debts. And much more money could and should be spent on upgrading our infrastructure, but it's not being. What will happen? It'll have to wait. Have to wait for a change of government. This government is ideologically not inclined, I think, to act against business in the way that would be necessary in this case. So an incoming Labour government, I think, would completely revamp the regulatory system, and I think would do a number of other things. The one thing it won't do, I think, is renationalise, because to do that would be expensive and it would be seen as rewarding failure. The companies would be paid to go away, even though they've done such a terrible job. So I'm not sure that's going to happen.
I think, yeah, the Treasury and the Department of the Environment, or whichever department it was at the time, they changed names so often, got outsmarted by the private equity guys, and the way that you can borrow and lend money to one another within the same nexus of financiers, so that they move the money out, so it's no longer available. Yeah.
The other problem about nationalisation is it would put us back in the situation we were in the 1980s. The reason for privatisation was that the government was not prepared to underwrite the very considerable investment which was necessary. Well, looking at the public finances today, I just don't see an incoming Labour government being willing to underwrite the investment that is necessary now. They've got to find ways of making the private sector pay. Somebody I noticed asked, when were the private companies nationalised? In London, they were nationalised or, well, municipalised or whatever, taken over by the Metropolitan Water Board in 1904. But in a lot of other places around Britain, private water companies have been taken over by local authorities before that. And so we went through most of the 20th century with a patchwork of private water companies and largely local council-owned water companies, which were all then privatised in 1989. I swapped to bottled water, says Odette McGahey, when we dropped the chemical levels as our first act outside the EU. I can understand why you might do that, but I'm sorry. I think you've made a mistake. The drinking water standards in this country are still high, and the environmental impact of drinking bottled water, the plastics involved, the transportation, it's absolutely horrendous. It's completely indefensible to drink bottled water, in my humble opinion. I would trust your tap water. Bear in mind, of course, a lot of bottled water you buy in the shops is tap water anyway. Just comes out of the treated water mains in wherever the bottling factory happens to be. Where water was taken from the tidal Thames, wasn't it unpalatable because it was saline? Apparently not. I find this slightly puzzling. There is a story that people complained at one stage in the Middle Ages during a prolonged drought that their beer, tasted salty because so many breweries were getting water out of the Thames, and the Thames flow was restricted, and so it was saline. Apparently, that was not an issue. It was certainly not as big an issue as the amount of sort of foreign bodies in the water. The first suggestion, Oliver says, the first suggestion for the super sewer was in the 1830s. Thomas Wicksteed's idea. Yes, was it Thomas Wicksteed's, or was it?
It wasn't Thomas Wicksteed. It was the Martin.
Yeah, John. I was going to say John Martin,
the
mad painter, whose
that's right.
brothers
yes.
were even madder than he was. One tried to set fire to York Minster. Yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry. Wicksteed is one of those names that one constantly shouts because otherwise people think that Basil Chet did everything.
Yeah.
Whereas his main achievement was making London to smell less unattractive. Because of the way in which water supply and water disposal developed, I think there was a very short period under the regional water authorities when the whole of the hydrogeological cycle was in one set of hands, and it became much harder for people to ignore what was going on with sewage discharges. Of course, that was smashed up when the water supply industry was privatized again, which was probably the biggest single environmental misstep that we took at that period. I mean, people see now, sort of lack of controls on things like building materials and so on, but the fact that the regional water authorities were responsible for the whole cycle from rain falling to water being taken up into the sky again meant that they had to balance. There was that interesting. I'm sorry, I'm wandering off into a wonderful field of images, but there was the standards for water to be used as drinking water regulations. So they weren't regulating the standard of the water you drank. They were regulating the standard, and there was a European community regulation on the standard of the water that you extracted from before it was prepared as drinking water.
Yeah.
Logic of that was that it really discouraged people from just assuming that they can chuck the dirty water away and not worry about it.
One reason I think why I think it's only with hindsight that it turned out to be an environmentally disastrous decision privatizing water. Because of course, although the regional water authorities had more responsibility than the private water companies do now, the crucial thing is that the private water companies, like their predecessors, and unlike any water business before the sort of 1970s, are responsible both for sewage disposal and for drinking water supply. So they had to be mindful of environmental quality. The one reason why it was a reasonable risk to privatize water under the regulators was because the European Union was bringing in a whole set of new requirements, new regulations, and provided we stuck to those, which we did, the water quality would improve. Joe?
But so I was just going to say that, if I may, that the sort of things that we now point out as being particularly egregious examples of failure, discharges of sewage into rivers and so on, is partly because the actual river part of it was taken out of the cycle. It was separately hived off into an increasingly castrated environment agency.
But the argument for doing that was that otherwise the regional water authorities and their successor water companies would be both kind of judge and jury in their own cause. It was thought to be a better idea to have an external regulator, an external monitor overseeing that sort of thing, because otherwise the water enterprises would cut corners. John Usher has said he grew up in Islington near the New River and now lives in Enfield, where there's also a wonderful surviving loop of the New River. He points out that the New River flowed in part through Theobald's or Tybalt's Park, which was owned by King James. The story goes that King James actually had a closer relationship with the river than almost any other shareholder, because after it was completed one January, he was out riding in Tybalt's Park and his horse threw him and he went headfirst into the New River through the ice and had to be dragged out by his boots. And not many New River Company shareholders could say that.
Wonder how that would have changed if he drowned. That would have changed our history.
I think Charles I would still have had lost his head and B, sold the New River shares.
Yes, right. Mary, do you want to elaborate on your comment about the reservoirs going down the Lee?
Yes, I mean they're a public benefit in ways aren't just to do with water, surely. And so I don't know what the West London one's like, but clearly the East London ones have a lot to offer of interest and I mean all sorts of other things. And you can walk down them, and as you can the New River, of course. There is a whole non-water supply aspect to water facilities, surely.
There is, though. I think a lot of the reservoirs in the Lee Valley, their amenity value and their sort of ecological value is greater because they're no longer reservoirs. They're not actually part of the water supply. The ones out in West London, which by and large are later, they date from the 20th century. Actually, that's a bit of a civilization, but they're enormous, and they don't seem to have any amenity value at all. They're just enormous, great banks or berms of grass-covered embankment behind which are penned up millions and millions of gallons of water, and they don't seem to have. Very few people have access to them. They're not visible from afar.
I have tried.
I bet you have, but no, they're very. It's a very flat landscape. You can't really enjoy them in the same way. It's the old reservoirs, the ones that have been taken out of service and been decommissioned, which are the ones like two just close to me where the New River now ends, up in Stoke Newington. One is used for sailing and wild water swimming and so on, and the other is a wetland bird reserve. And you know, we the public are allowed access. That would never have happened in the days when they were functioning reservoirs. John Usher's got another one. As I understand, he says only 8% of London water comes out of the New River. Yes, my understanding was 10% from my man at Thames Water, but I think what he also said was that it varies from sort of day to day. And 80% of that comes out of the Lee, yes. Now, the pumping stations along the New River are capable of refilling the aquifer in times of high flow. This is a reference to something called the artificial recharge scheme. If you walk along the New River, you'll find a whole series of little sort of concrete blockhouses, which were built in the 1980s. And they were built with a dual purpose. One was to pump water up from the aquifer to supplement the flow in the New River and to supplement older, mainly early 20th century pumping stations, which add to the flow of the New River. But also, as John says, the idea was that when there was lots of water in the New River and demand was low, you would pump the water back down into the aquifer to recharge it. What they discovered, was that if you do that with untreated raw water, the dirt in the raw water clogs the aquifer, and you make more trouble for yourself than it's worth. The only solution is to pump if you're going to pump water back down, it has to be treated drinking water. And they're a bit coy about this at Thames Water, but I don't think they do this anymore, simply because it seems a bit stupid to go to the trouble of purifying, treating water so that it's fit to drink, and then just pumping it straight back down in the cork and into the chalk. So I don't think that happens anymore. It was a lovely idea, but it was never really practicable.
Okay. Any more comments, Tom? Any more questions, observations?
If I may just come in again, just to remind people, of course, that the Barnes Reservoir in West London is probably a very good example of a reservoir that was converted early on to recreational use, the Barnes Reservoirs. To remind people of the story of the old lady who, when she was switched away from her sewage contaminated pump to clean water, said that it had lost all its nice taste. Another one of those possibly anecdotal stories. Of course, the New River itself, I think fairly early on there was legislation, was there not, to stop people bathing in it?
Oh yes.
Because it was a recreational source which was heavily used by naked men in front of parties of ladies. So that had to be discouraged.
The middle classes were horrified. The old lady who liked the taste, actually, that's not apocryphal. That is the 1854 cholera outbreak in Soho. Most of the deaths were clustered around Broad Street in Soho, but there were a few outliers. And one of them was a lady who lived in Hampstead, and she died of cholera. And the reason she died of cholera was that she was the widow of the man who owned the local brewery in Soho. And her sons ran the brewery, and they got their water out of a well. So their beer was fine. It was no cholera in the beer. But their mother missed the taste of the water from the local pump in Broad Street. And so they would send a bottle of water every day up from the pump in Broad Street up to their mum in Hampstead, and it gave her cholera and she died. And that is an absolutely true story. The reason was, as you said, they had a distinctive taste and she liked it.
I have I wanted to come back to this, just a silly list. I'm sure there's lots of people out there doing this. She reads all these health food books, and it tells her that Thames water, tap water, is full of chemicals and you mustn't drink it. So she fills great big jugs of it and puts it in a thingy for 2 days with some other chemicals in it to remove the chemicals that Thames water have put in it. And then drinks it, and I refuse to touch it.
Yeah, I have many criticisms of the modern water industry, but I do think that with occasional failure, occasional lapses. Broadly speaking, the quality of drinking water is pretty high in this country.
I had a question. I'm sorry, I can't make my chat thing work. How come the regulator got so toothless that it allowed so many abuses of the processing and everything to happen?
There were a number of reasons. One was the way the regulator we're talking about really is Ofwat. The two key regulators are Ofwat and the Environment Agency. Ofwat set up a system for encouraging investment in water by basically, at its crudest, allowing the water companies to make more profits if they made more investments. And arguably, it was a bit too clever because the companies found ways of gaming the system. They were cleverer than the regulators. They had very bright people who were paid lots of money. This was then made worse by the fact that the ownership of the water companies changed. Originally, they were all floated off, and this was part of Mrs. Thatcher's attempt to make us all a shareholding democracy. Everybody was going to have shares. In due course, all the shares were bought up by, first of all, initially, foreign utility companies, and then they were sold on to private equity of one sort or another, to sovereign wealth funds, to investment banks, and they were taken off the stock market. Only two of Britain's water companies are still quoted on the stock market. The rest are all owned by private equity. They don't have to disclose nearly as much about their financial arrangements. It's easier to pull the wool over the regulator's eyes in a situation like that. And the private equity investors were completely uninterested. They were completely unaccountable publicly. They were only interested in making money. The most egregious is one called Macquarie, which is an Australian investment bank. And the regulator was caught napping and has always been playing, Ofwat has always been playing catch up, and the companies have always been 2 or 3 steps ahead. The problem for Environment Agency was that they suffered from the fact that this government doesn't much like regulators and has gradually cut the Environment Agency's resources. And what money the Environment Agency does have is largely spent now on flood prevention, which is something that creates a lot of publicity when floods happen. And the part of the Environment Agency that was responsible for monitoring and taking action against water companies that break the rules and discharge sewage and so on have been cut and cut and cut. There simply aren't enough staff, and they're not able to do a sufficiently thorough job. They've been able to mount 1 or 2 very high profile and indeed successful prosecutions, but those require an enormous amount of work to gather the evidence and so on. And the Environment Agency needs a lot more money and a lot more people, and I don't think this government would give it.
But I think you're being a little kind to the government. They've deliberately set out to destroy the capabilities of not just the Environment Agency, but Natural England, Historic England, all the regulatory agencies. The most egregious example, again, probably being what happened to building regulations, where the price you pay is that occasionally 70 people get killed.
Yeah, you're attributing to them a malevolence, which I'm not sure I think is entirely justified. I'm not sure how deliberate it was, but it is the result of a ideological disposition. Goes back to Victorian times. These are private business. It's not the job of government to try and tell private businesses how to run their affairs.
Even if they're supposed to be offering a public good.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the fundamental themes of my book is that you private greed, public good. The public interest is not best served by organisations whose duty to their shareholders says they should be prioritising profit over anything else.
Yeah.
the point I make whenever somebody says, "Oh, don't buy from Amazon, they don't pay their taxes." They have to pay their taxes, and if they paid more taxes than they legally have to, their shareholders would complain and would take out suits against them. You know, they have to follow company law.
The fiduciary duty of company shareholders is to do everything they can to benefit their shareholders, and you've got to have a very robust, without breaking the law, and you've got to have very robust regulation, very robust laws to keep them in line. And certainly our regulation has not been nowhere near, as Oliver says, it's been nowhere near robust enough. It's been tough.
And of course, the bright people in government agencies and the Treasury and so on tend to get tightened off to the private equity investors and to the investment banks and so on. The brighter ones go away and fight against the ones that are left behind.
Yeah, afraid so. Right, so
somebody says is Kent water still from boreholes?
A lot of it is, yeah, I believe.
Good. Well,
Yes, particularly the South London ones. I mean, when I was very young, we paid money to the Sutton District Water Company, which was a private company in that interesting mixture that you talked about, and that was on boreholes. And I'm pretty sure the Croydon water supply still comes off boreholes.
Yeah.
The modern engines were pumping on boreholes.
As I said, I've got 2 works which Kent built down in Charlton on the Marsh, which were disastrous. But they had boreholes there, but they were contaminated, you know?
Mm.
I don't know about that, but yeah, quite possibly. It sounds plausible.
Back in the 19th century, when the Lambeth Company switched from getting its water out of the tidal Thames and moved to upstream, I mean, what did they just build a new main just for themselves? And why did they decide to do that? That sounds like a competitive disadvantage to invest all that capital.
Well, they thought at the time actually that they were doing something very clever, and they would have clean water that their competitors wouldn't have, and either customers would flock to them or they'd be able to make a few extra bob by selling their clean water to their rivals. The thing that made it affordable was that London was growing very, very quickly throughout the 19th century, and they, a bit like the BBC, benefiting from decades of switchover from black and white to colour TV and household growth. You know, it had a tremendously buoyant revenue, and so they were able to finance this. They moaned. The Lambeth Company, as far as I know, the Lambeth Company didn't moan. Some of the others did. The Grand Junction Waterworks at one stage had a secretary who thought it was absolutely outrageous that government was telling them to make investments which he thought would never make any kind of return. But government was insisting, and in fact, they did make a return, made a very satisfactory return, 10% return on capital every year. So they moaned, but they fell into line, and nobody went bust.
How did they get the water from upriver? Did they build cast iron pipes or elm wood pipes again?
James Simpson is interesting because he is the son of Thomas Simpson, and Thomas Simpson, who preceded him as the engineer of the Lambeth Waterworks and the Chelsea Waterworks, was the man who introduced cast iron pipes to London. He found a way to stop them from splitting with changes in temperature, and instead of just joining them with a flange, he took a variety of the thin end into thick end approach, and Thomas Simpson made possible a switchover from elm pipes to cast iron pipes, which made possible the arrival of constant supply. And what the water companies, not just the Lambeth, but all the others that went upriver, they built enormous, great pipes, mains, 36 inches, 3 feet in diameter, and sometimes several of these, 2 or 3 of these alongside one another. And they brought the water all the way from West London into the centre. And some company, Oliver mentioned the Barnes, the West Middlesex Company, originally got its water out of the Thames at Hammersmith and pumped it to customers from there, but stored it and later filtered it across the river in reservoirs and filter beds in Barnes. When they were told they could no longer take the water out of the tidal Thames at Hammersmith, they moved their intake upstream, but they didn't move either their reservoirs or their filter beds. So they built a big pumping station, but that was all they built at Hampton, and then an enormous great pipe that sent the water down to the reservoirs at Barnes and then put it into the filter beds at Barnes. And you know, a lot of that stuff's still there, still functioning. Great big pipes laid by the Victorians, periodically burst. I understand the water table, says Tony and Margaret Johnson, is rising as there is less extraction by industry. Is there scope for using this for drinking water? There is scope for using it, and it is. In fact, Thames Water pump now out of boreholes in central London. They never used to, but they do now to stop the deep basements and the tube from flooding because there are no breweries left in London and there's no industry using water. The water table is indeed rising. Another reason actually why the artificial recharge system along the New River is no longer it's redundant, because the problem with shrinking aquifers in around central London has gone away. That's not the case in the chalk hills to the north, where there's terrible over extraction. The pipes to the Tudor Palace at Greenwich, says Oliver, were lead.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's actually Elizabeth saying that.
And the same format as Roman water pipes. Quite possibly, yeah. I bow, Elizabeth, I bow to your superior knowledge.
Well, I was digging them up, Nick. The water was fed from the spring line on the hill, as it were. And in the palace, it was a feature of palaces at the time that they had piped water. And it was piped in lead pipes, as opposed to elm or cast iron. And funnily enough, the shape of the pipes was exactly the same as Roman lead pipes. The format, a curved oval with a V-shaped capping on top.
That's interesting. And of course, lead was used, the mains in the 17th, 18th centuries, the mains were made of wood, but private houses connected to the mains their pipes were lead. So there's a great deal of lead used, lead piping, and some people kept their water in lead tanks.
About the
In Yorkshire, in the 60s, had lead water pipes.
My house had a lead water pipes until about 4 years ago, when I had it extended, and the builders said, "You've got a lead water pipe here. I think we'll replace that." And I still have all my cold taps are still directly connected to the mains. Again, the builder didn't believe that. He said, "No, your bathroom, there'll be a tank." I said, "There is no tank. It's just comes straight in off the mains, and all the cold taps have mains pressure, but no longer a lead pipe." Sorry.
The wheels turned full circle on that, hasn't it? Because the newest systems can use direct water supply from the mains without a tank.
Do they?
The most modern design. But there's an interesting corollary to the decline of industry in London. The water supply in the aquifers has recharged itself, but also there was real concern 40 or 50 years ago that we were spreading a lot of sewage sludge, which was contaminated with heavy metals. That is now not a problem, apparently. And something like 80 or 90% of Thames Water's sewage sludge goes back onto the fields as fertilizer.
Does it really? And, but how do they manage to get rid of the heavy metals then?
Just
the
point about the boreholes and the extraction, that there were 3 artesian wells on the Greenwich Peninsula which are not now pumped. And I know that there are problems with water underground along Trafalgar Road and all that area where it's rising because the works was pumping all this stuff out of the peninsula. And of course, the whole peninsula is basically floating anyway on a lot of water. And you know, the tide goes in and out underneath it.
Break away and float down river one day.
The reason for the decline in heavy metals is because industry has stopped contaminating the sewage.
Right.
It's exactly the same reason that the water isn't being used.
Yeah.
So it does raise some questions about what exactly the breweries were doing.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? But I mean, industry included not just breweries, but dye works and manufacturing of all kinds. Yeah.
And you manfully resisted the temptation to have a discussion about how water was charged for because there were issues, weren't there, about how water charging was done for industrial users, which is a whole fascinating field.
Apparently at random. I mean, what they charge, the water companies charged large users what they thought they could get away with. There didn't seem to be any particular pattern to it. And there was one particular, I couldn't find it. I wanted to put it in the book and I couldn't actually find it. But the East India Club in St. James's Square, wealthy club, very wealthy part of London, bought its water from the Grand Junction Waterworks at more per gallon, at less per gallon than the Grand Junction Waterworks charged an orphanage. I couldn't find the details of the orphanage, but it was outrageous, absolutely outrageous. But they obviously thought, they could get away with it with the case of the orphanage, whereas there were too many influential people in the East India Club and they made life difficult.
Were the directors of the company also members of the East India Company?
If they weren't, they knew people who were.
Yeah. Right.
I wanted to quickly, Nick or anybody else, if they know anything about the early days of Brook Mill, I mean, pre-Kent Water. The reason is, and I'm very, very quick about this, and it's all in my book as well, that I don't believe that the Ravensbourne, as we know it now, is the proper river. The proper river wound itself up over onto the east of there. Somebody built that as a canal. And at one end of it, and the earliest map we have is 1897 Travers, and it's like a donut. So it's late 17th century. And the Brook Mill is at one end of it, and the Armoury Mill is at the other, and they're the chief suspects. Anything about the Brook Mill before Kent Water? Don't have to say it now, it's just flagging it up.
Joan and I used to live in Silk Mill Park in Lewisham, had a mill in it, although it wasn't a silk mill, but there we are. Very, very big centre of industry. Right, it's now 9:15 nearly. So thank you, Nick. You've been talking for an hour and 3/4 just about. Been fascinating.
Sorry,
thank you very much.
I can bore for Britain about this subject.
Your book, as you did the last time I heard you do this talk, but you can, if you go onto those links or search for Nick Higham on any bookseller that you fancy. I've also put a link up for the that wonderful cartoon, The Monster Soup for Thames Water, which, if anybody's wanting to talk about Thames Water to anybody, it's a great cartoon, and it's copyright free these days because it's so old. But there's various sources online, but Princeton University in the US has it. Anyway, thank you very much indeed, Nick. That's been a great talk. Thank you. It's been really entertaining, and thanks for answering all our questions. And it was a really good debate that we had following the talk. It was excellent to hear.
Not at all, but thanks. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, great pleasure. Mary, do you want to say a final word as a co-chair?
The next one is the 20th of June. It's Glyn Rees, who I invited to do because I read what he said about Upper Watergate and the, I don't want to use the word cobbled, but whatever it is, the oldest stone pathway in London. But he's done some great stuff since, and you should read his blog. And I hope that he covers other bits of building stone in the Greenwich area, which I've said to him, I hope is his brief, as well as Upper Watergate. Okay.
Thank you, Mary. And Mary has done a really great job in booking most of next year's talks as well. And so there's some great stuff.
Yes, I've begun to get people in. I'm looking, anyone's got any recommendations? I've booked already Rod Laguerre to do the Plumstead mining complex. So see where we go from there.
Right. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Nick. And thank you, everyone.
See you again, Nick.
There's a shameless plug for the London Museum of Water and Steam, and I haven't been to it for decades, so when it was called something else. So yeah, see it sometime. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay.
Thank you very much. That was
Thank you.
fascinating.
Okay,
Thank
all
you.
the best.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Nick. Thank
Yeah,
you.
cheers, Nick.
Bye-bye.
Great. Thank you. Bye.